online are amazing too.
Oh, I thought that's who you were talking to.
Amazing. Hey, Lisa. How are you? Good to see you.
Hi.
How have you been?
No one in my district knows that it's Yom Kippur.
Right. Right.
I keep looking at the phone like I'm just going to put it away. They're calling again.
Oh, no. Hey, Mira.
Hi, Carrie. Nice
Everybody, this is Mira. This is a family friend and relative of ours who lives in Texas. She is Dove Ray's birth grandmother, and I'm so excited she's celebrating this time with us.
Nice to meet you.
Welcome.
I have to thank you so much for the invitation to join the services this year. This has just been so touching and so wonderful. I cannot express my gratitude deeply enough.
We're so glad you're with us. This is the silver lining of this year is we're bringing people together from all over. We're going to focus on that anyway.
Yeah.
Hey, Annie.
Hello.
How are you?
Touching and so wonderful.
Hey, Annie.
I cannot express my gratitude deeply enough.
We're so glad you're with us. This is the silver lining of this year is we're bringing people together from all over. Am I hearing myself twice somewhere? We're going to focus on that anyway.
Apparently
Someone
there's a recording.
Annie.
has YouTube or Facebook up and needs to mute that page.
So somebody's live on 2 devices is what that means? Okay.
Let me make sure it's not me.
Or me.
I think it may have been Ellen who muted.
Great.
Dan, what kind of beautiful dog is that next to you?
That is Luna, and she is a Great Pyrenees.
Yeah, she's beautiful, and I love the way she blends in on the couch.
Yeah.
That's why we bought that color couch.
I was going to say, we're about to buy a new couch and the dog's color is a consideration.
For sure.
Hi.
Beautiful dog.
That is Luna.
Hey, Dan and Caroline.
Hello.
Way she blends in on the couch.
Yeah. We have 2 devices live again.
Okay, that's me. I'm going to just say hi and bye and go back to YouTube, but I wanted to say hi to everyone.
Hi, Nan.
Okay.
Hi, Nan.
Hi, Nan.
I just noticed this Zoom link that just appeared. I didn't see it before.
Yeah.
Zoom is better than YouTube.
This is
this is a conversation-based activity, so hopefully if you're comfortable on Zoom, people will be able to participate, but at least they'll also be able to hear the conversation on YouTube because some people don't love the privacy issues around seeing their face streamed to the internet. So with that, it's 1 o'clock. Gamar Tov, everyone. It's good to be with you. This is our beginning reminder to everyone that this call, this Zoom conference and conversation is being streamed. So there are choices to make about your privacy. You can participate in full voice and with your video here on the Zoom call. We love having you and hearing from you. This is meant to be an interactive conversation. But we also recognize that for some, that's not the most comfortable decision. So you can be on Zoom, but turn off your video and make sure your name is not displayed when your video is off. If you're looking for more privacy, or you can do as others are doing and join on YouTube and Facebook, whichever is the most comfortable way for you to be here. We are glad you are here. In reimagining our time this afternoon in Mincha, Beth and I were struck by how quickly it seems these readings that make up the heart of the textual tradition in our afternoon experience seem to go by. It's a long day of prayer. There's lots of words. And we find that the readings of the Torah and the Haftarah in particular are so interesting. We always want to spend more time with them, but we don't have the time in the sanctuary of Town Hall to do it. So this year we have recreated Mincha for us to really engage in the tradition in conversation together, in particular inspired by a new publication called the Book of Jonah, which came out of the CCAR press. And it is a social justice commentary on the Book of Jonah. So in this year, when we feel ourselves called perhaps more deeply and immediately than ever to turn to the work of healing our world, this commentary spoke to us and will be the guide for our time together. We actually will be hearing from the author himself throughout this service, as well as our own voices and conversations. So we'll have an opportunity to hear the Torah chanted and then to really dive in together to this textual tradition and our own response to it as a community. For those who are in the custom of wearing a talit throughout today's service, a reading from page 324 of our prayer books, if you have it at home. And if you don't wear a talit, the reading on the bottom. I will admit that this is a shawl I'm wearing right now. It lacks the fringes on the corners, so I will wear the blessing for not wearing a talit, but for wrapping myself in this moment. Please join your voice to mine. It's okay if you're muted. Fill your home with your voice. Holy One, your light enfolds me in beauty as I enter the Mincha service of this holy day. We will sing with our temple choir to get ourselves energetically moving towards healing. Ozi.
Ozi, Bezimratia, Vaihili, Yeshua. 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 Ozi, Bezimratia, Vaihili, Yeshua.
We continue with a reading of gratitude for our textual tradition.
We give thanks today for a Torah of life, the way of kindness, mercy, and truth. May compassion be our source of sustenance now, as in our people's past. May our souls withstand times of crisis and our hearts the inclination to evil. May the covenant of Abraham and Sarah strengthen our will to do what is right. May the qualities of mercy and goodness, love and forgiveness flow through our lives. And let us be strong in a perilous world. Let us open our hearts to the path of Torah.
We continue with a blessing, our hope that our time hearing Torah chanted this afternoon and engaging in learning of the Haftarah will immerse us in the call of this time. So we use this blessing for the opportunity to really engage, to soak ourselves, as Beth always translates it, in the words of Torah. Please join with me in the Hebrew or the English, whatever is comfortable and accessible to your lips. If you'd like to participate, but neither feels comfortable, you can add the word Amen at the end, saying, I would like to be a part of that as well. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, supreme power of the universe. You sanctify our lives with mitzvot and give us the sacred obligation of learning and living Torah. We continue with our Torah chanting this afternoon.
Vayadaber Adonai el Moshe lemur, daber el kol avdat b'nei Yisrael, v'amata lachem kiddishim tiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem.
לא תשנא את אחיך בלבבך, הוכח תוכיח את עמיתך, ולא תשב עליו חטא. לא תקום ולא תתר את בני עמך, ואהבת לרעך כמוך, אני אדוני.
V'hiagoritacha ger vartechem lo tonu otoho kezrak mikhem yehye lachem hager hagahar itahem v'ahavta lo kamoka kigerim heyatem be'eretz Mitzrayim Anihi Adonai Elohechem.
Having heard our community members chant so beautifully the Torah portion, we turn our hearts and minds to the words of the Haftarah, perhaps one of the most confusing, I think, selections for texts for today, although certain themes certainly live with us as we do the work of Yom Kippur. I want to share with you a very brief outline of the 4 chapters of the Book of Jonah. In particular, these were translated or summarized by Rabbi Ruth Gase, and her summary, I think, will help us to delve more deeply into specific texts that I'd like us to approach later in our time together. but it's important to know the context of those specific verses. Chapter 1, Rabbi Gase calls the call and the storm. God instructs Jonah to go to the great wicked city of Nineveh and warn its citizen about God's anger. Instead, Jonah flees and boards a ship bound for Tarshish. Once the ship is at sea, a terrible storm develops. The sailors try frantically to save the ship while Jonah goes to sleep in the hold. The sailors awaken him. He identifies himself as a Hebrew who worships Adonai. He tells them he is the cause of the storm and to cast him into the sea. They do so reluctantly, and the storm ceases. In chapter 2, in the belly of the fish, God appoints a huge fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah spends 3 days and 3 nights inside its belly and prays to God out of both despair and thanksgiving. The fish then vomits Jonah onto dry land. In chapter 3, the proclamation to Nineveh, God repeats the instructions to Jonah. This time, Jonah follows God's command and proclaims to Nineveh that unless the city repents in 40 days, it will be destroyed. Immediately, the inhabitants of the entire city, from its king to its domestic animals, put on sackcloth, fast, and turn aside from their evil ways. God recognizes that the citizens have repented and refrains from destroying them. And in chapter 4, Jonah's distress. Jonah is enraged by this turn of events and prays for death. He goes to the outskirts of the city, makes a booth, and dwells in it. God causes a huge leafy plant to spring up and provide shade over Jonah's head. Jonah enjoys the plant, but God sends a worm to destroy it. Jonah is left in the hot sun and feels faint. He repeats his wish to die. God points out that if Jonah cared so much for the plant he did not create, why should God not be concerned about the citizens of Nineveh? Jonah does not answer. I appreciate that Amy agrees with me that this is one of the strangest stories, and perhaps we can have a little bit of fun. I'm not sure I got it. That is as good a place as any to start. So I'm going to ask us to switch into the view where we can see everybody together, if that's possible. There's a lot of, I can't read these chats out loud. I won't be able to keep a straight face anymore. Okay, so if it's possible, I'd like somebody to tell me, other than what the funny things about it or the puns, why is it in the past, as you have heard Jonah chanted on Yom Kippur, or if you have heard Jonah chanted on Yom Kippur, what is your understanding that you've been able to hold on to for the connection between the Book of Jonah and Yom Kippur? And I think you should have the power to unmute yourselves. So Amy, I see your hand.
Yeah, do the right thing or you're going to be thrown overboard and eaten by a whale.
Okay, so there's the there's the reward and punishment theology at play for you right there, if you will, right? Do it, and if you don't do it, it's punishment. And a lot of what we read in the morning service, if you read it quite literally, follows in that mindset. Good. Dan, I see your hand there.
So it's about I think it's about the people of Nineveh atoning for their ways and being granted forgiveness. Although why the story then focuses on Jonah so specifically and centrally is a question.
Good. So it could be that the fact that teshuvah happens, right, is the focus. The Ninevites are actually the focus of the story. it's odd, of course, that we're concentrating on Jonah at the beginning and the end of it. But in some ways, you're a chapter 3 kind of person, right? It's all about that teshuvah that's possible and affected. Audrey, I see your hand.
The rest of me?
No.
So I think of it more, I mean, I think that's right about, I mean, I feel that about the teshuvah, and that's the really important thing. But I think it goes a step beyond that. It's about the nuances of life, and that nothing is black and white, even God's decrees. And that you sort of have to, I'm not going to say it this way because it'll come out as a pun. You sort of have to go with it and be led in different ways as is appropriate.
Beautiful. Charlie, I see your hand.
The words that have resonated for me over time is when we read the words about being swallowed and Jonah being in a whale for 3 days. And for me, it's a metaphor for how sometimes what goes on in our lives, just as, for example, now in the pandemic, we can be overwhelmed and swallowed whole by the events. And how do we get out of that besides just prayer?
Beautiful. So it's that time in the darkness, in the pit of despair that has spoken to you over these years. Good. Don, I see your hand, and Annie, I see your hand. And Bonnie, I see your hand, and we're going to have those be, and hi, and then we're going to close out the comments because we have lots more to do, but I love hearing these voices. Don.
So there is a strange aspect to this story, which when you think about when it was written and who it was written about, Nineveh was essentially the capital of the empire that about 60 years later wiped out the northern Jewish kingdom. And the tribes, I guess the 10 tribes of Israel that lived in that kingdom were then lost to history. And then this story was written sometime probably 150 years after that event. And so I sort of asked myself, well, why the choice of Nineveh, who became the conqueror of the northern Israeli kingdom? And I sort of come back to, well, if you want maybe an example of raw power, they reformed themselves, they got this ability, they put it to us, or to the folks who were living in the northern kingdom. And maybe we need to shape up too, or maybe we'll be next, which of course ultimately, anyway.
So if even those with supreme power in the region are cowed by this call of repentance, all the more so should we be?
That there's a lesson in it for us too.
Yeah, there you go. Love that. Annie.
So interestingly enough, this story makes complete sense to me. And I think it is entirely about the relationship between Jonah and God.
Tell me more, or tell all of us more, in fact.
It reminds me a lot of the play Amadeus, which is entirely about the relationship between God and a composer called Salieri, who is a rival of famous composer who I'm now blanking on the name of, Mozart, which people always interpret as a play about Mozart, but it's not at all about Mozart. So the story is about how Jonah wants to substitute his judgment for God's, and how God manages that, so that he's both accomplishing what he wants to, or God, they are accomplishing what they want to accomplish in terms of the warning to Nineveh and the rescue of Nineveh. But the side sort of trip here is about how Jonah defies God because he thinks God's going to be too easy on Nineveh, and he doesn't want to have any part of that. He wants the judgment to rain down. And then God forces Jonah back into his track so that he can witness both the repentance of Nineveh and so that he can come to understand what it means to be compassionate and how important it is for us to express our compassion towards all people, regardless of what they have done. And that compassion and consequences are two separate issues. So that to show someone compassion, even if they've done a horrible thing, is not to remove consequences.
Compassion and consequences are two separate issues. That is so gorgeous. It's really, thank you, Annie. And I don't know if you can talk and read at the same time, but you're generating a lot of really good conversation in the chat function. I can't. I just see it popping up and know it's happening.
I'll go read it now.
Bonnie, I had seen your hand, and then we're going to go to Hi, and then we're going to dive into the text and the author as well.
Thanks. My thoughts were already spoken.
Thanks, Bonnie. It's good to see you and Jacob. Many will know Jacob has participated in lots of our Torah studies before. It is one of my favorite things that he comes to make our Torah studies intergenerational. So I'm glad to see you two. And I love that you match today. You appear anyway on my screen to be wearing the same color green, which is great. Hi, who I lost in my screen shifting. There we go.
No, I was also going to say that my thoughts have also been talked about. So.
Well, isn't it wonderful to hear your thoughts echoed by members of your community, deepened or strengthened or challenged? That's what we do in this soaking, immersing ourselves in this word. I want to introduce you to Reb Shmuley Yankowitz, who is a colleague of mine from the Orthodox community, who's the one who wrote this book, the Book of Jonah, a social justice commentary that we'll be using to further our conversation and our relationship today. So I think that there's a video of me introducing him. Looks like it's coming up. Hi, everyone. Rabbi Chiari here. I am honored to be joined by Rabbi Shmuley Yankowitz. Dr. Yankowitz is the president and dean of the Valley Beit Midrash, which is organized around Jewish pluralistic adult learning and leadership in Arizona, a founder and president of Ori Litzedek, a Jewish social justice collaborative, the founder and CEO of Shemayim, involved in Jewish animal advocacy, the founder and president of Yatom, a cause near and dear to my heart as an adoptive mother. It is a Jewish foster and adoption network, and the author of 18 books on Jewish ethics. I'm really not sure when you sleep, but I hope you make time for it. Rav Shmuley has been named one of the top 50 rabbis in America, and the Forward named him one of the 50 most influential Jews. I was honored to be able to travel with Rav Shmuley on a trip organized through American Jewish World Services 10 years ago when we traveled to Senegal together, and since then have been an active follower of your Facebook feed and your career. And when you published this most recent book of yours, the Book of Jonah, through the CCAR Press in 2020, I immediately ordered it and knew that it had to come to my Temple Shir Tikvah community as part of our high holiday experience. So thank you so much for being here, Shmuley.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Chiari. It's a great honor to be with you, a great educator and leader, and your community. So thank you for inviting me.
So last night, Beth managed to make 2 of herself with the technology, so I had to try it today. I was so excited. And look, there were 2 of me on the screen at the same time. So Rav Shmuley, just to answer a couple of questions, yes, is ordained by the Orthodox community and lives and prays in the Orthodox world, and chose to publish 2 of his 11 books that he has written so far through the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis Press, which is the Reform Press the Reform Movement's group of, well, it's essentially the Union of Reform Rabbis. So that's who we are. And we have a press that publishes things like our prayer books, and things for learning. I want to bring us into the conversation a little more deeply here. We're going to hear a little bit more of the conversation I had with Rav Shmuley. Then we're going to study some text together, and we'll bring it all together in after that. So we're going to go back to video now. In chapter 1, you assert that protest is a religious act. And as I mentioned, as a social media friend of yours, I see you involved in protests, it feels like daily, particularly around the treatment of immigrants in this country. I'm wondering how you designate for yourself when you go out to protest that what you are doing is a religious activity. Do you think it matters that the others around you who see you protesting can see that you consider this a religious activity? And have you experienced any opening or closing of connections because you're approaching your social justice work through the religious lens? So that's about 10 questions right there that I'd love for you to answer any or all of as my earpiece falls out.
But in fact, we can live in a sleep-like state. But the opposite is being what we call woke, right? Actually waking up. The spiritual practice of waking up. And so protest as a religious act, as I see it, is the opposite of being asleep. It's really being hyper-conscious of what's happening in the world and joining one's mind, body, spirit, body, allyship into a particular type of religious activity. Now it's religious because, you know, there's so many commentaries on tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. Why say it twice? Is it just emphasis, something else? And I like to think of it that the first tzedek is about the ends. What are the ends we're fighting for? And the second tzedek is about the means. How do we fight for the justice? Justly, compassionately. It's very easy to be a mean or rude person, but have an ideology that lends itself towards social justice. It's also easy to protest and not talk to anyone while you're there or engage in any kind of menschlich way. And so the opportunity to be religious is to say, this is something holy, this is something sacred. I'm gonna bring a spirit with me to this moment, beyond just being here. You know, I was recently at a Black Lives Matter protest, thousands of people in the street, you know, and I saw my job as running up and down the crowd with masks, giving everyone masks. And while I'm there, I noticed that there was a gentleness of this group. There was a kindness of this group. And it really changed what it was about, because I've been to many protests where it's not like that at all. And so part of what makes it religious is the fact that the process itself has to be holy, not just what we're fighting for.
So I'd like to invite you just to comment initially on Rav Shmuley's idea that Tzedek Tzedek Tirdof is a social justice directive that is as much about what we are trying to achieve as how we are trying to achieve it. And then we're going to bring the Book of Jonah and a piece of his teaching into the conversation as well. But does anybody have an initial response, thoughts, questions to Rav Shmuley?
Well, he's echoing, in a way, what Gandhi and Martin Luther King had been talking about all those years, that it does matter how you protest, and they took the viewpoint of being nonviolent, and
Okay.
they may have had other things they talked about as well, but I'm not familiar. But for them, it was critical that there was a way to protest that would elevate the scene, elevate their cause as well.
I love that. That's so beautifully said, Hai, that the protest is meant as a form of elevation in and of itself, right? That it lifts up the goal of what it's trying to achieve. Anybody else hear anything from Rav Shmuley that they would like to respond to? Marian, I see your hand, and thank you so much for your beautiful teaching this morning. It was truly an honor to learn from you and to be with you here now.
Thank you. And I think that it's that that for me anyway, and this is a large part of my reaching in to act, is that my actions come from a soul place of compassion, and that I have compassion for those around me who are acting, but also compassion for myself, because I'm a constant learner. And, you know, especially doing racial justice work, I have to be compassionate to myself for the mistakes that I make along the way. And I think that that's part of the process. And that's what I take away from that, is, you know, having this bilateral compassion, if you will. Debarty.
Thank you for that. Let's turn with this question of bilateral compassion to the text, because it's an interesting question, the role of compassion by God and by Jonah. So let's turn to Jonah chapter 1, verse 2. I will read it out loud, and then let's talk a little bit about it. Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim judgment upon it, for their wickedness has come before me. That's Jonah 1:2. So we can take that slide down, I think. And what do you hear in there in response both to Marian's question and the conversation that Rav Shmuley started about the method or of protest being as important as what you are trying to achieve or what is trying to be achieved? Mira.
So one of the things that I think comes to mind in that is the fact that it's very easy sometimes to get caught up in what everybody else is doing. You know, there's a lot of talk right now about social justice and about how, you know, read this and become woke, go to this, you know, protest or whatever. But I think it's also important to check in with ourselves internally and not simply be following along in an outward manner.
Mira, thank you for participating. Other voices, I see Charlie, I see your hand, and Aaron, I see your hand, and I'm having a little internet instability here, so I apologize. I'm going to try to fix this situation.
So in the words that you just showed from 1:2, talked about the wickedness of the community, and Rav Shmuley talked about participating in a community of protest. And I can't help but think of, from my perspective, because of my background, how communities can go one way or the other. And I can't help but think of the Holocaust and how the communities some communities bought into that. And we have to know ourselves, and we have to look to appropriate values when we are part of a community. And what's also interesting is Jews are part of, we emphasize community so many different ways also.
Beautiful. So that role that you're lifting up of the communal in this question, which I heard at the beginning of Mira's comment, Hannah Arendt speaks about the banality of evil, right? And how the community can be a force that directs itself both for good and for evil. And that question of which communities we participate in, how we hear our values echoed in them, and when we don't hear a challenge to an outcome that is dangerous, potentially dangerous, yes, in that wickedness line that the Jonah text brings in. Aaron, I saw your hand, and then Leslie, did I see your hand as well? great.
Yeah, thanks, Rabbi Carey, and thanks everybody. There's such a strong connection in me between actually this like first close text reading and the concept of tzedek and what the rabbi talked about, in that I've worked as a union organizer for the past 8 years, and one of the most common refrains that I hear from people that I'm talking to when I'm advocating for and with workers is, well, you got to do it more nicely. You can't be so rude, and you got to understand that it's really hard for me as a manager as well, and all these pieces, and all of that is true, right? And it's important to hold that for most people, there is not just this deep ingrained evil going on that leads them to oppress others, to hurt others, to do violence against others. And yet all the same, it is important to draw boundaries, to stand for justice, and to declare what is right, even if that, and often because it makes people feel uncomfortable and change and do the hard thing. And so there's a way in which I heard a great Devar last year around this time that was actually about union organizing, that was about how standing up for justice helps us to call the conscience of the oppressor to bear and helps them to better themselves and recalls them back to the community. And so that to me is more, to me, tzedek, it's less about the kind of, well, we've got to like do it really nicely, we've got to protest really spiritually, which I think is true, but to me, it's more about there's justice to be done, and then that justice also involves the people whom we think we're fighting. And in the story with Jonah, we see that justice is done by actually drawing the boundary, by saying what's going on is not okay. There is a judgment going on here, and we abdicate our responsibility if we don't say that firmly and clearly and directly.
So beautiful. And Aaron, I'm going to ask you to read the quote from the book from Rav Shmuley later that we're going to come back to, because I think he's echoing a lot of the work you've been doing. So thank you. But we're going to gather a few more comments into this conversation. Leslie. And then I see Bonnie, I see your hand waving as well. And I've got a hand from Melanie. So we're going to go through these 3 comments. I'm always worried at the beginning of this that nobody's going to talk, but I just love you all so much because you all have so much to say and add to this conversation. And it's such a joy to hear our voices really making this alive. So I just want to thank everybody right now who's really giving themselves into this conversation. Leslie.
This is an oblique comment. It doesn't really speak to the text, but I often find when I go to protests that I feel choked up. That probably happens to me more in protests than it does in synagogue. And even though I don't really think of myself as a political animal, there's something about having my faith. Usually they're quiet protests. But even when it's not so quiet, I'm trying to figure out what moves me so. And I think it's having community, but faith that other people show up and care that much. And that sort of elevates me in some way. So it's just a feeling I wanted to share that I think is spiritual, I think.
Yeah, the power of the collective, the energy of the collective is really a spiritual experience for you at these protests, it sounds like.
Yeah, and toward what I think of as goodness or justice, because I'm thinking other kinds of protests which turn my stomach, or no, maybe they're not protests, they're rallies, they're rah-rah. That's a little different from protests, and maybe that distinction is important.
Oh, that's an interesting distinction to lift up, the movement towards something that already is versus the question of moving in protest or counter to something, and how does that change people's experience of that collective power, which, as Charlie spoke about at the beginning, can direct us towards good or not good outcomes. Beautifully said. Thank you, Leslie. Bonnie, I see your hand, and then Melanie. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm in my mind trying to bring the concept of protest to the Book of Jonah. And it seems to me that Jonah as a prophet is functioning as a protester in the sense that when we protest, we have a message. Black Lives Matter, anti-Semitism is bad, whatever the message is. And he's bringing a message from God, and he's a single protester. Now, we can question how effective being a lone voice like that is, and in the beginning, of course, it wasn't. What's confusing to me about the whole Jonah story is how at the end, when Jonah has been successful in bringing the message of God to the Ninevites, he sits there and he says it's evil. What is evil? Was it evil that he as an individual protester was sent? Or was it evil? Well, I don't know. And that's very, very confusing to me. But again, he is functioning as a protester. But what does that mean to us?
So what does it mean for the individual versus the collective? What does it mean if your ends are achieved and yet you are not somehow content with that? What is sending you out to speak in that way? What is the motivation of a prophet or a protester? I hear all of those in your questions, Bonnie. Beautifully stated. And Melanie.
Yes,
you
hi.
chanted Torah beautifully.
Thank you. Apologies for the construction sounds next door. I thought that I really liked Rabbi Yanklowicz's multiple interpretations of the justice, and I thought that it's one way to connect to the Book of Jonah, and that God tells this to him, but then has to tell it to him a second time. That Jonah doesn't just hear, like, go do this thing and then immediately go do it and have it work, but that God has to tell him and then pick him up with a fish, bring him back and tell him a second time. And so that maybe the justice is building in this repetition as emphasis, as direction, but also because sometimes it's hard to do and bears repeating, as in the comments, a lot of people are saying that Jonah's having this struggle and that it's about his personal journey into making this happen. Which also connected for me about how when it seemed like the change was, or the idea of it being holy as a method felt very internal, and so that it might be about not so much the protest at large, but how you approach it, about whether you're going and actually wanting the teshuvah to happen, whether you're going and like wanting things to work out in the right way. And so hearing the justice multiple times, really evaluating it, approaching it from that place, both in terms of the picture at large and also your role in it.
Right. He invites us to question very much our internal motivations and how they align with our external actions. Beautifully said, Melanie. So Erin, I'm going to put a quote up and I'm going to ask you to read it, because I think a lot of us got to it, but I think your work as a union organizer begs a question. I'll tell you an inside trick, which is in rabbinic school, they say, don't worry about the work, the people are the work. And it reminded me of this question of, how are you organizing people and working with them in a way that all of the communal is moving together. So I want to bring you this quote, ask us to screen share it, from Rav Shmuley, about this call to protest and what it means to protest religiously, to participate religiously. No, back one slide, sorry. There we go, the Book of Jonah. There we go. Aaron, do you mind unmuting yourself and
yeah,
reading
sure.
for me? And
Yeah.
this is, you can tell me afterwards that you hate this and it's not at all what you said. That's your right to say, but I'm just curious how this will land with you given your comments.
Yeah. The Book of Jonah opens with the idea that religious actions can be politically subversive. In the first 2 verses, God calls upon Jonah to become a religiously motivated political activist. God speaks to Jonah and implores him to remonstrate against an unjust society. While we often imagine public protest to be a secular phenomenon, in the Book of Jonah, God calls upon the prophet to initiate religious action.
So I'm wondering, and Aaron doesn't have to be the only one to respond, although I invited him to read this, of course, not having shown it to him beforehand, so not the fairest thing of me to do. But I'm wondering what you hear in that call of Rav Shmuli's about political action and religious action and the way they are interconnected between the two. And you can think of religious, or I guess I'm inviting you to think of religious as some of that internal work that Melanie was referencing in her comments as well. So we can take this slide down. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at it. And anybody who wants to respond to that idea that the call of Jonah is for politically subversive religious activity. Boy, that could get me in trouble with the IRS. Politically subversive religious activity. This is fun.
I just wanted to say something really brief, that I'm not so sure that we can throw in the word political in here. I think that we can speak about our situation now, and I think we need to have, for lack of a better word, kind of a respect or for situations as they arose at other times, and that I'm not. Yeah, so I was a little bit like, whoa, what's that? How'd that word political get in there? So
perfect. I love that question. How did political get in there? What does political mean in an ancient world where the religious world and the secular taking care of community would all be interconnected? It's a fantastic challenge. Hi, thank you. Lisa, I see your hand and would love to hear your voice added to our community.
I was thinking the same thing that Hai just said about how did that word get in there, and then reminded myself that, you know, every act is a political act, whether it's intentional or unintentional. But I'm still puzzling over the asker and God's track record in asking people to do stuff, and how Jonah may have responded based on history and what he was being asked to do, and whether he felt that he could actually do it, whether he was the one to do it in that moment. All of that is a political decision, without it, you know, political sort of on a different level. So, but I think there's something here about Jonah's relationship with God and who's asking, and God's track record.
Beautiful. Who's calling you to this action? And do you understand yourself to be empowered to act in response to that call, or to say to the caller, no, that's not my action? Those are fantastic questions for us to be considering. Audrey, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm wondering how Jonah is a protester. It seems to me he's not joining a protest, he's counter-protesting in a way, by talking to Nineveh about their protests.
Tell me more about that. Say that again.
I've always seen Jonah as an outsider, that he's sort of the guy who doesn't fit, you know, even in the ship at the beginning, he doesn't fit with everybody else. He's the different guy. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think if I recall the whole story correctly, the only Jew on the ship, and he has to explain that he's the Hebrew, and, you know, I think that's right, but I don't know. Mm-hmm. And he's like going into this kicking and screaming. And he's, he's like this lone guy that God picks who doesn't sort of fit in. And you could see it in the way he reacts when Nineveh is saved, in a way. It's like, I don't get this. I don't get what's going on here. You told me to go warn them and you were going to smite them, and now you totally back down. But he was alone. I mean, he was alone at the ship. He was alone in Nineveh, and he was alone at the end, suffering from the heat and the sun after God kills the plant that shaded him.
So the role of loneliness, right, of disconnection, of a different perspective than the communal.
Yes.
And then the question of the power that person has, given that they're inherently an outsider. What do those bring up? Excellent questions. And then Charlie.
In talking about politically active religiously, I can't help but think, going back to the concept of community, and the question that arises in making sure that you, the individual, are clear about the community you belong to, its values, because there are religious communities that think very differently, and we have to reconcile that at times. So we have to be very clear of what we've taken from our own particular religious community and how we're going to use that political power for what we think is good.
It's good. I have to admit, there's a part of me every time, even as a rabbi who thinks, what role does religion have in the public sphere, right? Wouldn't I just rather that all religion be taken out of the public sphere? But then the truth of the matter is, most people are motivated in part by the communal identities that they're carrying in their private lives. So if we bring our religious selves into the public sphere, are we just lifting up and making known, as opposed to keeping hidden that which is motivating us to act or to believe in certain ways? Joan, I see your hand.
Yeah, so I guess what comes to my mind in terms of this interaction between political action and religious background or religious action is the fact that you quoted, I believe last night or maybe last week, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I think is a perfect example of this, who was a cleric and had to speak out against the Nazis. And he ultimately lost his life as a result of doing that. And so, to me, there's really no, if he was going to follow his religion, he had to act politically. And I also have trouble with the word subversive. People were talking about protesting, but political. But I think the word subversive is sort of subjective, because what Bonhoeffer did was clearly standing up for what was right for people, the right of people to live. So it was subversive versus the Nazi view, but it wasn't a subversive idea.
Right, that question of ultimate ethics versus the laws of the society you're living in, right? And who has the ultimate claim on truth? And if what you're doing is subversive, if it's subverting the laws of a society that's unjust, is that really a subversive act anymore? Well, listen, folks, there were supposed to be 4 sections of the Book of Jonah that we studied together. We did one. We did one. In what world did I think I was getting through 4 of them with you? But I want to pray that these conversations motivate us as we go out to act in this world, that we question ourselves and our own motivations, and that we question how we act towards those motivations in the world, and that we see ourselves constantly striving, not always achieving, as Marian spoke about, because we have to see ourselves as learning, but constantly striving to build a world that embraces more and more the right of each person to be seen in the image of God and to be held and trusted with that image for themselves. So how we act in that world is motivated by who we are, and who we are is determined in part by the communities we live in and the traditions we inherit and how we interpret them. So I want to offer you the words of our choir as we close out today's thinking time of Mincha, to remind us that we do have the chance to build this this world in a way that the subversive is never, that the world is never in such a way that when we act in protest, it's because we know what we are working towards is good. And I want to just remind you of a couple of these, a couple of things you can try to get in touch with after this. If your appetite was whetted, I'm sorry, I'm losing my words. That happens sometime around 2 o'clock on Yom Kippur afternoon during a fast. It's 1:57, so there we go. This book is the Book of Jonah, a Social Justice Commentary by Rabbi Dr. Shmuley Yanklowitz. We will try and make, it's about a 30-minute interview he and I do, where we have a discussion about this book and the Book of Jonah. We'll try to make that available to you on our website. I highly recommend this book, and I am sure we will continue to delve together as a community into this question between our identities and our actions and how they work to build a better world together. So with that, these words of our choir to lead us out.
Olam chesed yivarech, yadadai, yadadai, yadadai. Olam chesed yivarech, yadadai, yadadai, yadadai. Olam chesed yivarech, yadadai. World from love, and you must build this world from love.